ocean's whisper calls my name. Depth and longing in my soul, seeking more than just this game. Waves crash softly at my feet, echoes in my heart so deep. Eyes on horizon far and true, longing for a love so steep. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Echoes in my heart so deep, eyes on horizon far and true, longing for a love so steep. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Shells and sand beneath my toes, tides reveal what ebb and flows. In the quiet still I hear whisper longings crystal clear. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Desire, burning with a holy fire. Depth of love beyond all dreams, in the vastness it redeems. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore.
Hello, and welcome to Deep Calls to Deep Waters Deep, but the conversation is shallow. How's that? I'm Phil Bray, and I've taken over the channel. This is a first for me. I'm sitting in the interviewer's chair. No, so actually we're going to be talking about the blood on the lintel, or the blood on the door frame. And I'm here with Amber Marone, who is an Ezekiel nerd. And I noticed a passage in Ezekiel that talks about blood on a door frame that we'll get to. That's a teaser. But I guess we should do introductions. I'll start, but then I have a question for you. I'm Phil Bray. I guess I've sabotaged the channel. But I've got the YouTube channel Leviticus is Fun, where I make short, try to be educational Leviticus videos. Just released a book. It's on the butcher's block, and I'm excited to chat about Leviticus and blood. But Amber, tell me about yourself and about why we would talk about Ezekiel.
Okay. Well, I am getting ready to start my final year in seminary, getting ready to do my thesis. And that's going to be quite the harrowing experience, I think, because I picked a whopper of a topic. But I'll get into that on another video. And then I just am a huge Old Testament nerd. I love learning and studying Hebrew. I'm getting into and going to be diving into Greek and the Septuagint and how those work together. I love just all things, definitely Hebrew Bible. Ezekiel is my favorite book of the Old Testament and of actually the whole Bible. There is always a reason to bring up Ezekiel because Ezekiel is referenced everywhere, even if people don't realize it. So I'm going to actually, I got on my bucket list to do this really awesome look and deep dive through the book of Ezekiel. I just haven't had the time to give it the proper reverence and respect that it needs. So I'll get there one of these days. But yes, there is always a reason to bring up the book of Ezekiel because it is the best, definitely in the Old Testament for sure. And I think in the Bible. So that's that. And we're going to be talking about it because, like you did hint, there are some echoes of this whole idea and the wording here in the Hebrew that are going to maybe ask some interesting questions about Passover and the Passover event and what this word means and why we should care that there might be another way to look at this.
Yeah. So I'm actually very excited, partly because these are honest questions that I have. I'm excited to chat through it. I'm not 100% sure where we're going to go, but these are questions I've had for quite a while, and connections that I've had or I've noticed as well into Ezekiel. I think I might try and set the stage. So we're going to be talking about blood on the doorframe, specifically asking the question, what is with the blood on the doorframe? Or why was the blood painted on the doorframe? Is it an ancient thing, or is it a biblical thing, or is it both? And then how might that surprising verse in Ezekiel help us maybe get some more information on that question? There's a couple of other exciting questions in there, like who is the destroyer in Passover? And this is a surprising one for me. I didn't expect that we would go here. What does the word Passover actually mean? Because when you start reading scholars or the Septuagint, there's some surprising meanings. So I might just read, there's kind of a key verse in Ezekiel. You've already converted me.
I'm
In
working on
Exodus.
it.
I'll just read the kind of key verse in Exodus. It's Exodus 12:23. It says, "And Yahweh will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and he will see the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, and Yahweh will pass over the doorway and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you." So first I want to talk about Passover, or the word Passover in Exodus. So the word only shows up 3 times, I think, that specific word. And they're all here in chapter 12, in verses 13, 23, and 27. And in our English Bibles, you'll only see the word Passover. It only gets translated as Passover. But if you read the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation from 2nd century BC, roughly, things get really interesting because in Exodus 12, they've translated that one word inconsistently. So Exodus 12:23 in the Septuagint says, "The Lord will see the blood on the doorposts, and the Lord will go on by or pass by the door." This is where it gets interesting. The other 2 times in verses 13 and 27, the Septuagint uses a different word. So verse 13, it says, "The blood shall be to you a sign upon the houses, and I will see the blood and shelter you." And then in verse 27, it says, "He," that's the Lord, "sheltered the houses of the sons of Israel." So, and that's the same word in Hebrew. Yeah. The same word that we normally translate as Passover. But the Greek translates it as shelter. For some reason, the Greek translators chose shelter. Yeah. And another thing, in the early Aramaic Targums, I think they're written between the 1st and 7th centuries AD, they translate that word as spare or protect, which is kind of similar to shelter. But tell me about the Hebrew word. So does it have a range of meanings like the Aramaic and the Greek, and does it have anything to do with protection or shelter? Because my
Okay.
Hebrew
Yep.
is bad or non-existent. This is why I'm
All
here with
right.
Emma.
Yeah, when Phil actually contacted me about this question, I got really excited and I was like, gonna kind of slow down for the summer, but I'm like, I gotta squish this in because this is an amazing question. I love this. So, first, I want to talk about a little bit how Hebrew kind of functions as a language for a second before we dive into why there is this conversation at all. Because Hebrew has this it deals a lot in metaphor, and so it will pack a lot into one word. So each word can have a wide Semitic range, depending on the context of the image that it's trying to paint, because Hebrew thinks in pictures. So when you're reading Hebrew and you're looking at a passage and looking at you have to step back and look at what picture are they trying to paint here, because that's going to help us understand how best to use that word is in that picture that's being built. So in this chapter, we're looking at the Exodus, preparing for the Exodus, and God is telling them how to the instructions for what they need to do, because the destroyer is coming to bring judgment on the firstborn. And so the word there was really interesting, because when I went back to look at this, I was expecting to see the word Pesach, which is the word we commonly think of as Passover. That's the word that is referred to as the festival, the holiday, and going forward, observing in remembrance of this event is Pesach. But here in Exodus 12, this is Pasach, which is a root for this word, which is the different. So it's really, I mean, and just going down the rabbit hole was a whole lot of fun. But the root word here of Pasach is to be lame, to limp, to pass over, or to spare, is the very short, basic semantic range of that. Because this can also be, it's interesting, the like to be lame or to limp, this word can also be used, a form of this word in reference in Leviticus to animals that are not, they're not perfect animals for sacrifice. So they are Pesach, not eligible to be sacrificed. So it's really interesting how like crazy and complicated this word gets. It can
So is
also
that when
mean,
the animal is called lame and
uh-huh,
it's
it is
blemished or not
yep.
unblemished?
Yep,
Ah,
it's
right.
Pesach. Yep. Yeah, it's really interesting. So, and this word in BDB can also be just pass or spring over. Okay. And where we get really fun with this, like you said, in the Septuagint, and we get into the Greek, and this is scapazo. Is this? I mean, that's a terrible. It's probably not pronounced correctly because Greek is not my thing, but scapazo, which is to cover or to shelter. In the New Testament, we see that the root of this word gets used a lot in Paul and in the conversations about head coverings. This is the same word that gets used there. So it's like a covering, which in that debate, you can go watch that debate, but that also can be used as shelter or protecting, is in one of the meanings of the head coverings is a covering for protection of women. So we got to kind of get that in our heads. But this word scapazo can also mean cover, protect, shelter, conceal, cover up, hide oneself, to be hidden, um, secret things. So it is very much got this idea of putting a covering or something over something to protect something that's under it. Is the way that the Greek Old Testament is using this word, the Greek Septuagint. So actually the Greek is really helping us out here by giving us more of an understanding of the depth that's happening in the narrative of Exodus. Because remember, with Hebrew, we have to step back and look at the picture and the story that it's trying to tell. So, and when we get to Ezekiel, it's going to get even crazier about how this is going to get cosmic and weird, because that's what Ezekiel does. And that's why I love it so much. So that's the basics of linguistically what's going on here, Phil.
Yeah, right. I just as you were talking, I was wondering how the word is translated when Adam and Eve are covered with the garments of skin. I wonder if that's a similar word.
I don't know. I'd have to go look
With
that
the
up.
covering, or when Cain,
Right.
when Cain is
Yeah.
covered with a mark of protection. But
Right,
yeah,
because it's
that
not
can be
Pesach.
homework
It's
for
not.
afterwards.
Yeah, it's not Pesach, but I would guess it might be Scapazo. I don't
In
know.
the Greek.
I'll have
Yeah,
to
yeah.
look.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll have to go look that up later. That's a good question.
Yeah. So if we are you saying that it's possible that we can take the meaning of protect rather than pass over in the Hebrew? And if that's right, how would it read if we were to do that?
Okay, so if you go back and look at verse 23 there in Exodus 12:23, and if you look at the second half of that, because this is the part that really, really got interesting. When it says he, meaning Yahweh, will see the blood on the lintel and on the other two and on the two doorposts, and Yahweh will pass over the doorway and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. Okay. So if we were to go back and use protect instead of Passover, this is how this verse would read. He, Yahweh, will see the blood on the lintel and the two doorposts, and Yahweh will stand guard over the doorway and not allow the destroyer to come into your house to smite you. Which that to me creates this really beautiful picture. Because I think one of the things that happens here in this translation conversation is there is when you're translating sometimes in this imagery and where this word usage, and because it's used the first, it's really only used in regard to this event that we call Passover, and in observing in this source and the origin of Pesach, of the festival and the remembrance, it's really easy to say, okay, this is the same root word, so we're going to go back and we're going to translate this Passover because it's the same, it's the birth of that event. So we'll just Passover because that's what kind of we see happening here. But I think when you go back and you pull in and this idea, because to me, when I read this before I started learning Hebrew, I always kind of had it in my head and was always kind of taught this idea of this blood on the door with this translation of Passover was kind of an imagery. And I'd heard this preached before, this imagery of like skipping rocks over water. So like they would see the blood and it would just skip to the next one. Like, when you try to skip rocks on the water, which actually in Hebrew or Greek isn't really what's happening here either way. We have so many theological and narrative and imagery assumptions going in that sometimes we don't always think about, well, is this really what's going on here? So when you take both the Greek and the Hebrew and you hold those together, I think together it makes this sense that both meanings together create this beautiful picture. So because God is standing guard, protecting at the doorway, then the destroyer is going to pass right on over, like keep right on going. So I think together they really give us this beautiful, rich picture of what's going on because that door is protected, the destroyer is going to pass on by and just keep right on going.
One thing I hadn't really noticed until looking at it recently, that am I right in saying that it doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense, because it says that Yahweh will pass over but will not allow the destroyer to come into your house, which is something that, if it is protect, then it makes a whole lot more sense. Yahweh will protect and will not allow the destroyer, rather than Yahweh will pass over and not allow the destroyer to come into your house. So who's doing
Well,
the passing over if it's Passover? Is it the destroyer
right.
or is it Yahweh?
Well, this is where it gets really, really interesting because this is where we get to dive into the prophets. And I love the prophets. And we get, we're going to see this it was Ezekiel. It's in it's in almost every one of the prophetic books, the imagery that we're going to dig into here for this. So, okay. So this word that was used for destroyer has a couple of different meanings, but the two that we care most about are that it can be an act of destruction, or it can be an event of destruction. Those are, kind of together there. And it can be, so there's three we're paying attention to, sorry. And it can be used in a noun form that can be a person who destroys or lays waste to something. So you've got those three meanings there. And when you're looking at is Exodus 12:23, this is a noun form of this. So it could be an event, an act, or it could be a person. This is where we got to go back into looking at the prophets and how the prophets use this idea. And it is very common. You'll see this, especially like Isaiah, Jeremiah go crazy with this. Minor prophets go nuts with this idea. God will use an agent to be the bringer of the act of the justice that's being meted out. But then the language is still like, God did this, but he did this proxy with this other. So think about it like when Israel, the northern kingdom, fell, God used Assyria as his destroyer agent to bring about his justice and his judgment on Israel through Assyria. So Assyria was the destroyer in that scenario, but God is still the one who did the destroying. He just did it through Assyria. And then later, not only does Judah get Babylon as their destroyer, Assyria also gets Babylon as their destroyer because Assyria went too far. So then God uses this word destroyer against Assyria and against Judah as his agent to bring about his justice that he is making happen. Does that make sense?
Mm. Yeah. So is it any different in the Passover passage where it's not? I know they don't have proper nouns, but it's not distinguished as though it's a proper noun, or like it's not. Is it used differently to when it's the Babylonians or the Assyrians or something?
I didn't find anything that was, because Hebrew does what it does. It's kind of holding this tension of these three possible noun uses at the same time, the same way it does in the prophets. So it is this agent who is a person, for lack of a better word, because that in the prophets is corporate language there, and we're dealing with this spirit, this spirit of destruction who's coming. So that's the person, the player who is acting out an event. So it's kind of holding in tension three ideas at the same time here, image wise.
Yeah, right. And we might get to it in a bit. So we could be saying that that it is still Yahweh doing it, but he's using an agent.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's making sense.
Right.
So I'm just trying to scroll down. Yeah. So one thing I discovered was that there's another destroyer kind of figure that early Jewish traditions talk about. But I was wondering if these early Jewish traditions had similar questions, or they were confused about who did the smiting. So the Book of Jubilees is a book from the 2nd century BC, and it's actually in the Ethiopian canon. It's part of their Bible. So in the Book of Jubilees, they have an interesting interpretation for who is actually doing the destroying in the Passover story. So Jubilees says, this is Jubilees 48:2, I think. As basically, bit of background. Basically, Jubilees is a retelling of a very creative retelling of Genesis, with lots of focus on dates and days and times and patterns of 7. You should read it. It's a great read, along with Book of Enoch. They're both the extra books that are in the Ethiopian canon, but are in no other Bible. It's very fascinating. if you're a nerd like us. So, yeah, from Jubilees, it says, as the people of Israel were eating the Passover in Egypt, all the powers of Mustama had been let loose to slay all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the captive maidservant in the mill and to the cattle. So Mustama is basically a Satan figure in Jewish literature. He turns up a few times elsewhere. I think he turns up in the Bible as well.
Mhm.
But basically, I think the early Jewish people saw him as like a Satan figure, but they saw him as the one who was destroying the firstborn. And whether that was like Jewish lore, Lore, or whether that was just them getting loose and creative and retelling the story. But it got me wondering, so when the Bible seems to say that Yahweh passed over, but then the destroyer did this destroying, or was it Yahweh doing the smiting or the destroyer
Mhm.
doing the smiting? Are the authors of Jubilees rightly hesitant to attribute the killing to Yahweh? Like, are we too quick to put the smoking gun in Yahweh's hand? Are they being more righteous than we are by not wanting to attribute the killing to Yahweh himself? Or are they just being creative? Like, yeah, do you have any thoughts on how we should read Exodus
Yeah.
specifically?
I think it's really, really interesting that there's a couple things concepts that we kind of need to keep in mind that aren't this word, but they're going to help us understand this word. Okay, so my first Hebrew professor, Dr. Kutz, who just recently passed away, was one of his favorite words to teach us how wonky Hebrew can be was the word ra, which we translate in our Bibles, you'll see most commonly translated as evil. However, this word is going to help us understand kind of this idea here because the word raw itself does not carry an inherent implication of moral corruption. Sometimes it is just an outcome that sucks for somebody that we don't like. And that is the morally not morally corrupt, the morally like I can't think of the word that I'm thinking of. Agnostic, I guess, view of bad things happen, right? So a storm that destroys crops in a field is referred to as an act of raw. It's not deliberate, morally corrupt evil. It's just a bad thing that happens to somebody. Okay. Like a lion or a wild animal that kills a gazelle to eat it for dinner, that's referred to as raw, acted upon the gazelle. It's not that the lion is being like some kind of psychopathic, serial killer. It's just not a good outcome for the gazelle in that scenario. So that is raw to the gazelle, right? And God uses this word in when we talked about before, like that agent, the destroyer. So ra is the same word that is used when God uses the destroying agent. It is referred to as ra because it doesn't end well for the person on the receiving end of it. God does not use morally corrupt things. That just doesn't work. But the actions of God can be referred to as ra. And Dr. Kutz explained it this way. Because Ra is not inherently morally corrupt, it can be used by God and not become wicked or intentionally evil. Hebrew has very specific words for wicked and intentionally evil. So if that's what was happening there are words for that in Hebrew. However, when fallen humans try to use Ra, because of the consequences of the fall, it cannot but become anything but morally corrupt or inherently evil because we are fallen. So the distinction there is God can use things in his omniscience and his hesed in ways that we cannot, that are not morally corrupt. So God is using Ra, who's using a bad outcome to bring about repentance, to bring about restoration and redemption. Humans can't do that because we don't have that perfect knowledge of Hesed that God does. Okay. And then again, like in the prophets, portraying an agent to act out judgment, like Assyria against Israel and Babylon against Assyria and Babylon against Judah. God can use these things again to break their hard hearts and to bring them back into repentance and restore them to relationship. So that kind of helps us understand that, yeah, God can use this agent. And really, a really interesting thing, it just kind of occurred to me when we were talking about that in Jubilees and the Mastema. It sounds a lot like the idea of, so when we get to jump into Leviticus 16 a little bit here, Phil, just for you. So
Yes.
the Day of Atonement, right? And one of the functions of the Day of Atonement is to cleanse the space for God to dwell with his people again that year. Because of there is this like sin residue that just collects and is drawn to things that are holy. This is kind of an idea that we've kind of gone over, and I think we kind of went into the last episode of Why Leviticus Matters. We kind of talked about this a little bit. There is this dark energy-ish kind of stuff that is drawn to that which is holy, and that's the same root word here that they're using for this Mastema, agent of destruction. It's related words. So it is the idea of the collection of evil, but it can be an agent that is used by God who is not doing morally corrupt, intentional harm of wickedness. God is using this agent, this mastema, to, one, bring the repentance and bring about the repentance of Egypt, and to bring his people out and to restore a relationship with his people and the family of Abraham. So there's repentance and restoration trying to go on all over the place here. God is just using an agent that has a connection to evil to do it, which is very, very interesting, I think.
So can I maybe try and summarize? Because I remember listening a while ago to a Bible Project episode where they talked about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but they said that it was probably more helpfully the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, because it's Tov and Ra.
Tov and Ra.
Yeah. And so if you're saying that it doesn't connect to moral evil, although it can, that God can. So God actually does Ra in the Bible sometimes, doesn't he? Yeah. So if he is responsible, or he brings an earthquake or a tree falls over, that might be Ra if it falls on someone's house, but it doesn't mean that God has done something morally evil.
Right. Let's go back.
Ra.
Let's go back to the tree of life. That is the choice of Tov and the choice of Ra. That is the choice of life or the choice of death. So the outcome of Ra is death. The outcome of Tov is life. Sometimes God has to use death, result of death, to bring us back, to bring about repentance that starts the process of redemption. So God can use Ra and death for good. We usually cannot. Does that help?
Yeah. Yes, but it brings up a whole lot more questions about how a tree falling on a house would be the wisest thing in a scenario, even though it's bad. And yeah, like that's why it's
that's another discussion we can get into.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So can we talk about blood?
Absolutely.
So one of the questions I had was the blood on the doorframe, or the blood on the lintel, and what that means and what it symbolizes, or maybe it's not symbolic. Maybe it's only our Western brains that think about symbolism. But so in Leviticus and sacrificial rituals generally, in ancient sacrificial rituals and the Bible, blood is associated with purity or life, as we just said, and cleansing. And Leviticus 17 talks about the blood is the life of the animal or any creature and a human. And when blood comes into contact with something impure or something that has been tainted by death or impurity, the lifeblood removes the effects of death, or the Bible says the blood purifies that which was impure. And connected to that, hyssop is used to paint the blood on the doorframe. So Exodus 12:22 says that the blood was painted on the lintel with a hyssop branch. And hyssop is also connected with cleansing, because Psalm 51:7 says, "Cleanse me with hyssop and I will be clean. Wash me and I will be whiter than snow." So I wondered, but I wanted your thoughts on it. I'd kind of assumed that in the Passover story, because the blood is painted on the doorframe with a hyssop branch, that it was marking out as clean and pure all who are inside the house. But maybe this is where Ezekiel can help us out. Kind of just wanted to get your thoughts on that, but I'll read that verse in Ezekiel that we've been hinting at. So Ezekiel 45:19 is, the priest is to take some of the blood from the sin offering and apply it to the temple doorposts, the four corners of the altar's ledge, and the doorposts of the gate of the inner court. So help us out. What's the context of the temple here? Did the temple need cleansing? Am I right in saying that it's purifying and protecting who's inside the house, or is there something else going on?
Okay. So first of all, we got to step back and zoom out on Ezekiel for just a second. So it's my channel, so I
You
get
can
to
take
nerd
more than
out
a
about
second if you
Ezekiel
want.
for a minute.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, Ezekiel is a fascinating and complicated book. Okay. And Ezekiel himself is writing this, having visions about everything that's happening in Babylon, which is unheard of because usually, you're in your sacred space. And so there's a whole lot going on there. We don't have time to unpack. But the beginning of Ezekiel is talking about the desecration of the temple, God leaving the presence of the people, the Shekinah leaving the temple, and then the temple falls, and then everybody is exported out of. So you got all of that that's leading up to this, and then the last 8 chapters, Ezekiel 40 through 48, is the picture of that new temple and Yahweh returning to his people. Okay. And in that description, especially in that section in 43, that is describing, along with the new temple, all of the personnel and the supplies in the storerooms that are going to be needed to operate that new temple. So it is image wise a whole lot that's going on, the same that was happening with the first temple, because you had all the personnel to run it. You had all the tchotchkes that you needed for it to do that. You had the storerooms of supplies. You had all that stuff. That imagery is being repeated here. So in Ezekiel 43, 1 through 12, the prophet sees Yahweh returning to the temple, dramatically proclaiming that the glory of Yahweh filled the temple. So you've got the return of the Shekinah as well that's going on there. So what are we talking about here? Okay. Ezekiel is talking about the re-implementation of the worship in the new temple. Okay. So prophetic language makes this really interesting because, as with all prophetic literature, without a divine interpreter, we can only truly know the fulfillment in hindsight, which we learn from Deuteronomy 13. It talks about the test of a false prophet. You only can know if they're a false prophet if their prophecy comes true or not. So Ezekiel, we haven't seen the end of this book yet, right? Depending on, that's a conversation I never get into unless I can, if I can help it. But it does help us out. So if we go back again, Phil, just for you, to Leviticus 16, and we're looking at the Day of Atonement. The tabernacle has to be annually, go back and has to be cleansed annually. This practice is continued, we think. I think there's a couple places I found it. I didn't write them down. But when Solomon's temple is built, this continues. Because they have to, they get all set up and they got to bless and cleanse everything and get everything going. But by the time the prophets come along, this isn't happening. And in fact, the beginning of Ezekiel is about this exact thing that has stopped happening because the temple is so gross and so desecrated that God can't even be there anymore. Because why? Partly because they're just Israel and that's what they do, and partly because they're not observing this Day of Atonement practice anymore. So you see all that. And then we have to go back, and this whole other idea that comes in with this painting things on the lintels on the doorway. This is the idea of sacred space. So I want to talk about that for just a second. So in the ancient Near East, in this world, kind of in this time that we're living in Ezekiel and in Exodus, both, this is one of those fun ones that kind of has continued for a long time. Places where a divine encounter happens are deemed sacred space. That can be in a real physical location, or it can be in a dream, or it can be in a vision. So sometimes this is where prophetic imagery comes in and gets wonky here. It's creating a sacred space. But that's what the tabernacle was for. That's what the temple was for. Those were sacred spaces where you could encounter God. And so when you walk through Genesis, everywhere humans encountered God. That's where they talk about those rock piles. And you see them all throughout, like all up through, I know Joshua's got them. There are several places where you'll see them stop and build a little rock pile. That is a marker of sacred space. So if you're walking along in that time and period and you see a little rock pile, you're going to go, oh, somebody met a deity here. And that was important because you could return to those places hoping for a repeat divine encounter in their minds, how they would see that and think about that. So that creates a meeting point, a gathering point for a place where you can go and meet your deity. Okay. And there are rituals in all of the religions for claiming that sacred space. And this is highlighted in Exodus and Numbers. And every time the tabernacle moves with the people, there's instructions to disassemble, transport, and reassemble that tabernacle. And all of those are claiming sacred space. So every time they do that, and then they have to go through that whole process. And then Leviticus 16 is an annual reclaiming of that sacred space for Yahweh. Every year he's reclaiming Israel. He's reclaiming the tabernacle. And it's just this like renewal thing. Like, we're just going to auto renew your, my claim on this is my sacred space while you guys do this ritual that's laid out in Leviticus 16. So that's preparing that space for God to dwell with his people, which comes with one of the functions of that is protection, because God has promised that he will be there. They won't need, that's why they don't need, the big standing armies and things all the time in the instructions in Deuteronomy, because God is supposed to be their protector. Right. So that's part of the claiming of sacred space. So that's kind of how we get right there.
Yeah. So the purifying and the cleansing is part of it, but only one layer.
Right.
The deeper meaning that you're saying is the reclaiming or the claiming of or marking out of sacred space, and the cleansing is just one step or one layer in that. Yeah, that's fascinating. So just to clarify, the temple that Ezekiel is talking about, is this this is a hypothetical temple to come?
When Ezekiel's writing it, yes. This is where things get really weird, and it depends on how you read a lot of other things, and it really depends on your view of eschatology and time, and if you're a dispensationalist or not, or that is where it all falls down and gets crazy, depending on what you bring to it. I think that this is imagery that Revelation is referencing, maybe directly quoting, but definitely referencing when it's talking about the new heaven, new earth. But then it gets weird because God is the temple. So there's it, but that's a little too complicated for this conversation at the moment.
But Ezekiel wasn't actually standing in front of stones and bricks himself. Yeah. So to bring us back to Passover,
hmm
is if the cleansing and the purifying with the blood is one layer of that bigger picture of sacred space,
hmm
um, is it possible, or if it's possible, to read the word Passover as protect? Um, then how might we read the blood on the doorframe in Exodus with Passover? And then how might what
Right.
we've just said about Ezekiel and the blood on that door help? Because this was
Right.
actually my original question. Does
Right.
Ezekiel help us understand what's going on with the blood on the doorframe in
Yeah.
Exodus? But now
It,
that we've this is the rabbit trail. Now that we've gone down does Passover mean Passover, or does it
right.
mean protect? So yeah,
Right.
can you help us out? Does it give clarity, or does it just make it more
Oh,
exciting?
yeah. No, I think it makes it even more exciting because if you look at we go back to what we talked about how blood is used, but blood represents life in the Hebrew Bible. And it makes perfect sense. So one of the main concerns of Torah, which Exodus and Leviticus we're talking about, that's Torah. One of the main concerns there is the preservation of life. A lot of the instructions that are in there for in Torah, a lot of even Leviticus 16, the preservation of life, that is what is important to Yahweh. So if you look at it that way and bringing that into the equation, in the Passover here in Exodus, the blood on the doorframe is protecting or preserving the life of those in the house. And that is done by having the destroyer pass over this protected sacred space. And I think that completes the picture really beautifully. And when we bring Ezekiel into this, this is how this is about the change. In the first 32 chapters of Ezekiel are about judgment and the dealing out of judgment. And then 33 to the into the book, so to 48, is about hope of salvation and redemption. So the blood on the door in the new temple, that is going to be the permanent, forever dwelling place of Yahweh with his people, mirrors the salvific imagery of the first application of the blood in Exodus. So, for example, Ezekiel describes two very similar annual festivals, which are hard to align with the three different annual festivals that are going on with Passover and the Feast of Weeks and Feast of Tabernacles that were established by Moses. But Tamar, I first found this really interesting quote by Tamar, Dr. Tamar, who explained it this way: God's presence will return. However, when the divine punishment has run its course, in Ezekiel 43, 1 through 9, the final vision report in the book of Ezekiel describes how the new temple will be built. So chapter 40 through 43, 11. This new temple comes with new regulations, Ezekiel 43, 12 to 46, 24, relating to the altar, to the status of the Zedekite priesthood, the role of the Levites in the celebration of festivals, surrounding the temple and the temple with its as its origin. There will be a new land with new borders, and in the midst of it, there will be special allotment for God, sacred space. There will also be a new Jerusalem, which in the name of which will be God is here, right? So Ezekiel is kind of bridging for us how the first Passover event and the blood, the protection of life, the deliverance from judgment brings us out and restores us into permanent dwelling with Yahweh one day. So it's about hope, and it is about so that blood on that door is a reminder in Ezekiel that the salvation and the establishment of permanent dwelling place with Yahweh is bringing the hope that Israel is longing for. Oh, I think I lost. Are you still there, Phil? I don't know if he's can. I think he's frozen on my end. I don't know. Okay. Well, hopefully we'll get Phil back here in a minute. Oh, yep. He froze and got kicked out. So we'll give him a minute to come back. While we're doing that, I'm going to go up and answer this really quick, this question for a minute here. So, what would that mean to the next generation? It could still go into the promised land because they did not yet know the difference between Tov and Ra. So, this is something that the Old Testament, in the story and the narrative of the Old Testament, teaches us that every generation has to relearn this lesson. So every generation has to go back and learn the difference between Tov and Ra, to learn the difference between the choice of life and the choice of death, the choice of choose God or choose destruction. Like there's it is a question that all of us have to relearn every generation. So yes, the Israelites would have needed to relearn this lesson going back into the promised land, but all of us, every generation since the fall has had to relearn this lesson. So hopefully Phil will make it back in. Let me see if he sent me a message really quick. Oh, there he is. Okay. All right.
I'm back.
All right. I answered a starred question while you were gone and waited for you to keep going. So
Great. Thank you. Where did we get up to? Did I miss
I
much?
finished. No, you didn't. I just finished with the blood on the door as a reminder that the salvation and the establishing of the permanent dwelling place of Yahweh is the hope that Israel is longing for. And that's what Ezekiel is pulling in that reference with. So, and then you can take it on to the next question there.
Great. Sorry about that. Maybe my kids
It's
have just
okay.
woken up and turned the Wi-Fi on. It's about 6:00 here. Yeah. So something else I noticed was when I was reading through Exodus 12:7. It says, "They shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat." But I also noticed that some translations, like the King James Version and the New American Standard, they use the word house instead of temple in Ezekiel. So I wanted to know, are they the same word in Hebrew, or are we just reading that same word house in English?
No, I'm going to say yes with an asterisk, because typically when you'll see this word used as temple, it always comes with a qualifier, like with Yahweh. So you'll see it in combination. There's a word for that is falling out of my head at the moment. I can't remember. There's a technical term for this, and then I can't remember it. But right now you'll see it was translated as house of Yahweh, which is a common reference for temple all through the Old Testament. It's not just in Ezekiel. You'll see when you see house of God, house of Yahweh, that is, it's referring to the temple as house, but it has that qualifier, whose house it is. So, and interestingly enough, Phil, the town of Bethlehem is the house of bread, which gets really interesting when you bring that into the Eucharist conversation, which we can't have right now because we don't have time, but it's really there. Yeah, houses all over the place. They've got all kinds of little houses running around in Hebrew.
So if that's the case, are we to imagine the people of Israel sitting in like multiple little family temples? If the blood is on the house, is that, and the blood was on the doorposts of the temple in Ezekiel, is it picking up imagery of mini houses or sorry, mini temples in the midst of Egypt? Is this like mini protected spaces? There's the word protect in the midst of like an Egyptian tyrant who was bad. Is that what's going on?
I think so. I think there's a lot of things that are going on that echo this idea. When we get into Exodus, Leviticus kind of really brings this home, that sets up that Israel is okay. Now I'm going to use a word that certain people in certain traditions don't like this word, but don't get lost on me here when we use this word, because we're just seriously talking about a prescribed order. So many parts of Israel's liturgy of worship. Okay, so don't freak out. We're not talking about anything bigger than an order, a prescribed way that we do things. So their liturgy of worship was prescribed to be done at the temple. However, there's also parts that could and should be done at home. So does every home come with a Levite priest that brings offering to Yahweh and the same as the temple? No. Were there practices that happened at the temple and at home? Yes. So washing with water for ritual cleansing happened at both. Prayers happened at both. There's an overlap of the dwelling of Yahweh and these ritual practices and liturgy of worship that happen in designated. So we go back to the sacred spaces. So it creates these little pockets of sacred spaces that we interact with Yahweh in. And in the Old Testament, that's done by at home doing your ritual cleansings, following the food laws, and observing that liturgy of life prescribed for staying in at one-ment with Yahweh.
So there's another question. Was this something that was already happening in the ancient world of putting blood specifically on the door frame? Like, was that a common ritual within the ancient context of the ancient Near East? Or was Yahweh prescribing it for the first time? Like, which came first? Is Passover riffing off an already existing ritual that their neighbors would have had of painting blood on temple doors? Or is Ezekiel riffing off the Passover symbolism? Or was it just an accepted thing that everyone did in temples? Or even
So
houses?
yes, all of the above. So kind of what's going on here, but they're very different, because a lot of what we see, what God does in the Old Testament in the ancient Near East context, is because when he pulls out Israel, it gives them an observance to do that is similar to the pagan practices around it. He is also separating and redeeming the practice at the same time. So first we'll talk about the ancient Near East practices, and then we can kind of touch on how that gets separated out and redeemed to be used by Yahweh. So here we get to go into this really, really fun thing that, again, is another word that might freak some people out, but don't get crazy on me here, okay? So the idea of blood in the ancient Near East, especially in the pagan context, could be seen as protecting a building and its inhabitants. That is a common thing in the ancient world. Doorways and thresholds were seen as spiritual vulnerable points, liminal spaces where benevolent spirits needed to be welcomed and malevolent ones needed to be barred. So your door was a portal for spirits and demons to come in and out of your house. Okay, in the ancient Near East world, because they didn't have an idea of a separation between sacred space of a spiritual life and an everyday life. That was not a concept they would have. If you had asked somebody in the ancient, like if you walked up to somebody in Leviticus time and asked them about how their spiritual life affected their everyday life, they'd look at you like you just said the dumbest thing on the planet, because they'd have no clue what you were talking about. There was not a separate idea in their minds, right? So we see in Mesopotamia, there are multiple instances where there are incantations and rituals, texts used to preserve and protect homes from demons, ghosts, and diseases that involve putting blood on doorways. The Hittites ritual text provides some clear examples using blood for purification and protection, purifying a house, driving out the impurity known as a papahatar. Could involve sprinkling or smearing blood from a sacrificed animal. Canaanite and Syrian cultures, sacrificial systems were central, and the belief in demons and the need for magical protection was pervasive. It's highly probable that the I can't say that word, so that their similar uses of blood rituals existed in Canaan and Syria as well. So what we get down to and how this is different. So we got this ancient practice that's happening, and then God is saying to them, well, they're sitting in Egypt in the middle of a place where this kind of thing is going on. I want you to do this same thing that they're doing. However, there's a big crucial difference here because the ancient pagan cultures are doing this as magic rituals that ward off or obligate their deities to do something. So they're trying to obligate them to protect them from bad spirits and obligate them to allow the good spirits in to bless them. So it is magic that obligates a deity to something, that obligates them to do what man is asking them to do. What God is doing here is covenantal. So this is God saying to initiating this to man, saying, you do this and I will protect you. Man had nothing to do with the prescription of this ritual. They did nothing to initiate it. It didn't come from, so this is God entering into a type of covenantal protection relationship with the people in Egypt that is his, the family of Abraham that he's getting ready to bring out. So anyone who does this and participates in this ritual, because that's what it is, we don't need to be scared of that word. It doesn't mean they're, summoning demons or, there's not got a bunch of Gandalf the Greys running around. This is just a ritual, which is a participation in liturgy. That is how how they would have participated in a covenantal act. So God is taking this from being a magic obligatory act to being a covenantal relationship act and initiated. So the main difference is in the pagan cultures, it was initiated by man to obligate God. And in the covenant relationship, it is initiated by God as a protection and a relationship with man. So the origin point and the obligated one is different.
Sorry, I was just frantically writing notes. It's actually, super fascinating. So you're saying that it was an existing ritual,
Mhm.
but Yahweh is taking that kind of what they thought was maybe a magical ritual, or they were interacting with false gods or
Mhm.
demons. But Yahweh God, the true God, is taking that ritual and he's reclaiming the ritual. And at the same time, he's reclaiming the space from the
Mhm.
other powers who were seen to have kind of invaded that space and made that space impure. So
Right.
actually, that's super helpful because if it was like unclean spirits, they would have made the space impure. And so not
Mhm.
only does that space need to be reclaimed and purified, and the thing that purifies the space is life, which totally makes sense because
Mhm.
it's God is the God of life.
Right.
And
He's
so
also
he's
claiming protection of the inhabitants in the house at the same time as well.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. That is fascinating. Um, and then just so this is what I was frantically making notes about because I'm at the end of my questions. But so you said that anyone who participates in the ritual was protected or came under that,
Mhm.
life blood. Um, and so then I was thinking that when Jesus talks about his own blood, he calls it blood
Mhm.
of the covenant.
Mhm.
Um, and so I was thinking that Jesus is reclaiming the act of blood, even from the old covenant.
Yep.
Jesus is reclaiming that already reclaimed act,
Right.
um, and reclaiming it for all of humanity, for everyone,
Right.
for us. Um, so he's reclaiming it as, and I guess, and I would love to chat about this. He's reclaiming it and calling it, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out
Mhm.
for you." I think he says, um, but he is taking something that was maybe just protection like we've talked about, and taking it into covenant language, but it's something that we can all participate in. Is that what you're understanding?
I think I would nuance that a little bit differently. I think I would say that what Christ is doing is taking that Old Testament ritual that had been claimed by Yahweh, that was temporary, that needed to be renewed on a regular basis, and constantly reclaiming that space. However, for whatever reason, it needed to be reclaimed either annually on the Day of Atonement or for a whole other various reasons, that is the existence of the book of Exodus or of Leviticus, right? And Jesus is taking that reclaimed ritual and making it permanent. So it goes from being temporary, that needs to be redone every time we need to do it because of reasons of Exodus and Leviticus, and making it a permanent thing. So Jesus's blood, that's a permanent, doesn't need to be, Jesus doesn't need to die over and over and over and over again. That blood doesn't need to be, doesn't need to be used and applied over and over and over and over again in that sense that we're talking about here, of this preservation of life, of this protection. Jesus takes what God had already redeemed as a not permanent measure and makes it a permanent measure. That makes sense?
Would you say, and is this going too far, that if the houses were areas of reclaimed space, and that those inside that reclaimed space were seen as coming under the purifying blood or the life-giving blood, and being part of that covenant relationship with Yahweh, that we today, having been sprinkled with Jesus' blood, can we see ourselves as I guess mini temples, or is the church today the temple of Yahweh, in the same way that we've been sprinkled with blood, but we're reclaiming space? Or is it that I guess this is a massive conversation, that the whole world has been reclaimed? I guess no, the whole world has been reclaimed and purified, but we're just, I guess, trying to work that out in real time for us as mini sprinkled temples, or the church is the temple, walking around trying to reclaim the space. Maybe help me finish that thought.
Right. So this is how I kind of see that, because you've got two things kind of going on here in Exodus. He is corporately setting aside a group that he's going to pull out, but it's done in individual pockets in everybody's houses, right? So if we look and bring that into the New Testament through Jesus and Jesus's blood and what's going on there, corporately he's talking about the church, but that applies to us in our little pockets. So as believers, I think as Christians, our homes should be little mini churches, because our families are our primary form, and our primary focus of ministry is our families, because that is how we live out being the church, is the examples in our families that we then take out and share with others. Right. So I think it's a perfect model for the corporate of the church that is lived out individually in our homes, that Exodus here is kind of giving us that picture.
Yeah, cool. That's fascinating. That's all I had for you. How did I go as an interviewer?
I think you did really great for your first time. It's harder than people think it is.
Yeah, I didn't even look, or I kind of skimmed the comments, but yeah.
Well, this would be a perfect chance. If anybody has any questions before we shut it down, Phil, if you've got a minute, if anybody wants to throw up a question. And definitely, if you haven't yet, there's a link in the description. Go get Phil's book, because Phil's book, I think, is now my favorite book about Leviticus.
Thank you.
I love that. It's a great book. I know. I will have to have you back to talk about this some more. But about your book some more because it is great. It's a fantastic book. I love it. I highly recommend it. So if you don't have it, shame on you. Go get it because it's great. It's a great book.
And
Well,
we're going to be chatting next week, about
mhm.
we're up to Passover, so we're going to
Yep.
be expanding, but more focusing on atonement.
Right.
Um, this is part 3, I think, in our chat on why atonement
Yep.
matters.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. And this episode's going to go in that playlist because I think we're leaving out the blood on the door of that episode because you and I are talking about this week. So that's going to go in the playlist so people can go back and refer because we're going to pass right over the blood on the door and the meaning of the blood on the door because you and I are talking about this week. So
yeah,
so that'll go in that playlist as well. But
yeah. There's
yeah, I'm
lots of
not seeing
connections.
not
It can
seeing
it
any.
can
Yeah.
it can sit within the canon of why Leviticus matters.
Absolutely, because Ezekiel and Ezekiel is better. But so I'm not seeing any questions coming in. So Phil, where can people find you? Because I think you have one of my 2 favorite YouTube channels that I actually watch on YouTube.
um, so I am on Leviticus is Fun on YouTube. That's, I think, mostly where I'm interacting, and on Facebook. But yeah, Leviticus is Fun on YouTube, and I try and post weekly videos and try and keep them under 5 minutes. We're up to chapter 8. I've been working through from chapter 1, not really verse by verse, but trying to cover everything in the chapter. Right now we're up to chapter 8, and we're talking about the consecration of Aaron and his sons as priests. We're about to get up to the blood on their earlobes and their thumbs and their big toes, which is
Mm,
very exciting. But
interesting.
yeah, that's where I am. Leviticus is fun.
And there's also a link below to your website, which is great.
Yep,
Love
there's
the
some
website.
articles on there. Yep,
Uh-huh.
ubiquitousleviticus.com.
Right. Ooh, do I
Um,
get to write an article for you, Phil?
yeah, I would love you to. I would love, yeah, seriously.
All right.
Um,
Yeah, and then the link for the book. If you don't have the book, shame on you. Go get it right
mm,
now because it's a great book. It will really help. It helped. It actually clarified some things for me too, and it's a great read because it's not. I mean, it wasn't aimed at being scholarly, so it's not technical and complicated, and you don't have to stop and look up words every 3 words or 4 words or so. So it's fantastic and it's humorous and it's a great book. I highly recommend it. So if you don't have it, go get it. But thank you for invading my channel today. This was great. I had a lot of fun.
yeah, no, seriously, thank you for having me. And yeah, they were honest questions that I really wanted to dig into. So I've learnt lots. It's been great.
All right. Well, thank you, Phil. That was fun.
Thank you.
Next week, Why Leviticus Matters Part 3, we're going to tear apart Passover. The festival, I think, is what we're really focusing on is the festival of Passover. So
Mm,
we're talking here about the event that starts the whole thing. So there's 2 different Hebrew words involved as we started with. And so that how that's going to affect Leviticus, which is made better because Ezekiel is going to talk about why it matters.
yep.
So I don't know. I've sat shotgun with you guys through this whole thing. So you all are going to have to come join me for an episode of Ezekiel.
I would love to.
It's been awesome. All right, everybody. Thank you so much, Phil, for coming. Thank you for having bringing this question to me because I saw the question and I was like, this is amazing. We got to talk about this. You're right. We'll do your channel or mine. I don't care. Let's just talk about this because it'll be a fun discussion to have. Definitely please like and subscribe and go to Phil's channel, like and subscribe over there at Phil's channel. And then I'm going to put in a plug really quickly for my other favorite YouTube channel. I usually only watch 2 YouTube channels regularly. One of them is Leviticus is Fun, and the other one is the Trauma Informed Church Kid by Spencer Owen. The other soon to be convert to an Ezekiel fan. So yeah, go also check out Spencer's channel. He's great. Thank you all for coming, and I really hope that all of you have a beautiful and blessed day. And around here, every day, our focus is to try to journey to dwell more deeply with Christ. one day at a time. So go and be blessed.